I'm Lou Canellis, joined, as always, by my good buddy from Bears Game Day Live, Bears Blitz partner, Anthony Herron. All right, Ann, I want to get right off and talk to you about what happened yesterday at the Combine and what Bears Brass said about literally where the Bears are in this draft process, what they're looking for at the scouting combine. Anything really stick out after you heard Ryan Poles and Ben Johnson?
It seemed like both men were indicating that they felt like the roster certainly will need some additional work, but both indicated they didn't think this was a team that was far away from really being able to compete in what's the deepest division in football. There's no reason to think the Detroit Lions are going anywhere, even though several of those assistants in Detroit have joined Ben Johnson here in Chicago. Minnesota Vikings, we'll see what they do at quarterback, but Kevin O'Connell has shown he can continue to win with a variety of QBs in recent seasons. And, of course, the nemesis, the Green Bay Packers, had that nice moment closing out the season with a win over the Packers, but they've got Jordan Love, they've got young talent. But in this division, there's a lot of talent there. At wide receiver, at defensive back, a couple of position groups that Bears fans should feel really strongly about. And, of course, the young quarterback. The line of scrimmage, though, if you can bolster that, then it feels like this is a team that should be in a position to compete at a high level. Line of scrimmage
on both sides of the football,
yeah, right.
Not only offense but defense as well. All right, let's go live to Indianapolis where we pick it up with Cassie Carlson. Players have started to talk to the national media there. Cassie, what's been enlightening for you so far?
Well, I think it goes back to what we talked about yesterday, that the Bears aren't the talk of the draft this year outside of Ben Johnson being the new head coach. And actually, it seems very mellow for an NFL combine today. It was a late arriving crowd, although defensive linemen did talk early this morning at 8 a.m. Eastern time. And I was just talking to ESPN's Jeremy Fowler and said, from a national perspective, what's the story of this draft? And he said it's all about the quarterbacks, not necessarily it being a strong quarterback draft class, but talking about where they're going to go, because there's talk that the Titans don't want to take a quarterback with the #1 overall pick. They're likely looking at someone like Penn State's Abdul Carter, the pass rusher. So where will a Cam Ward, where will a Shadur Sanders, where will those guys fall in the first round? Because it's not necessarily a strong quarterback draft class, but as we have talked about, it's really strong in the trenches with offensive and defensive line along with running back. So it seems very mellow, which is interesting because it's been go, go, go the last two combines I've been at with the Bears just being the talk of the town.
And I would say, guys, that that's something, Cassie's point is 100% accurate. The way these quarterbacks are perceived right now, you'll see multiple guys likely go in the top 10. But if we were dealing with a season where a bunch of quarterbacks, 3, 4 quarterbacks, maybe going ahead of the Bears with the number 10 pick, then that would push more definitively the top offensive linemen, the top defensive linemen further down the board if this were one of those drafts where people were going to reach to try and make sure they got their quarterback of the future. And even though a lot of teams are still around the league maybe uncertain about what their quarterback position will look like in the seasons to come, this isn't a draft cycle where folks are looking to reach for the guys at the top of the board.
Cassie, you had a chance to chat with new Bears head coach Ben Johnson yesterday, didn't you?
Yeah, really great conversation with the head coach. Actually, a one-off story I want to talk about him because Ryan Poles mentioned he has the highest football IQ out of anyone that he's ever been around. I actually just think he's just a high IQ guy because before we sat down, we were talking about what chairs we were going to sit in. And he goes, wait, you sit in the other chair usually, because in our first ever interview on his introductory press conference day, we were sitting on opposite sides. And I don't know if he has a photographic memory. I just thought it was really telling as to how detail-oriented Ben Johnson is. But we talked about offensive line, we talked about his coaching staff, and of course we talked about Caleb Williams. Can you put into perspective maybe how much having a strong offensive line in Detroit allowed your offense to be so explosive over those 3 seasons?
Yeah, well, that offense there in Detroit, that was all predicated on what our players did well. And so because we had the luxury of a very good offensive line, that's what we looked to capitalize on and feature. I see Darnell Wright very much in the same mold as a Penei Sewell, and we tried to do things the last 3 years in Detroit to highlight Sewell in space, highlight him on one-on-one blocks, him against their best defensive linemen. I see the same thing for Darnell, and that's where look forward to getting to know him a little bit more this springtime and in training camp. But what I saw on tape last year showed a lot of promise in terms of the player that he can be.
When you get the chance to sit down and watch that tape with Caleb Williams, as you had mentioned, you want him to see the game through the lens of your own eyes.
Yep.
What are the questions you're going to ask him come April when you're in the room together to get a feel for what he feels strongly about when it comes to an offense, or what makes him comfortable?
I think probably one of the starting points we'll have is going over last season. I do want to watch last season with him, not to revisit anything from to linger too long from a year ago, but I need to know his foundation. I need to know what's going on in his head. Probably less schematically and more so some of the situational things that popped up. Just what he was thinking, what the communication was like on the headset, just so that I have a baseline to know what he's been exposed to so far. And then once we have that, we're going to be able to build from there. We've got a number of great coaches, whether it's Declan, JT Barrett's going to play a huge role in Caleb's development. Press Taylor's got a lot of experience with young quarterbacks as well. And so we've got an army at our disposal. We just got to utilize them all.
What was the biggest thing you learned from working with Jared Goff of getting the most out of him that you feel like you can apply to a different player, but situation where you want to, get the most out of Caleb Williams in a year that's critical to his development as a young player?
Yeah, I think, the one I learned so much from Jared. I learned so much from all those players there, but one thing always resonated with me. He said, where communication lacks, negativity fills. And so what that meant to me was, as a play caller to the quarterback and vice versa, there can never be any gray. We need to just make sure we're always on the same page, even if that means we're saying the same thing again over and over and over, because we just don't want to leave anything up for chance. We're all in this together. I said just a minute ago to somebody else, Caleb's success is going to be my success and vice versa. And so we truly are married in a way.
All right, so that was head coach Ben Johnson. We also talked about him creating and putting together this coaching staff, because he made it a point while standing at the podium to say he didn't just go out and do the easy thing, which is hire a bunch of friends. It's very strategic how he put everything together. He said Antoine Randall L., we know him as a Chicagoland native, Thornton Township High School. We had a little back and forth about how good of a high school athlete he was, and talked about how much he is going to play a part in these wide receivers' lives and the entire team being an assistant head coach. And also, I want to mention something that Lions head coach Dan Campbell said. He's a guy that lost both of his coordinators, and he said the best advice he could give them is the most important thing you're going to do is hire your staff. So selecting those people are going to be crucial to the success of you and your team. And it seems like he was very proud of how Ben Johnson handled that. He also mentioned that he's one of his best friends, but he does have to play him twice a year, and that all goes to the wayside when they will meet the Bears this season.
Yeah, for sure. Great communication, by the way, with these Detroit Lions between the coaches and players. Stick around, Cassie, because I want you to hear this, and I want to get your feelings on it as well. Really feels like the Bears have come a long way from last season. The NFL Players Association released its annual report card for all 32 teams today, and the evaluation of former head coach Matt Eberflus really stood out. Ranked last of all 32 coaches. And here's what it said, quote, the players' most frequent complaint was with their former head coach, Matt Eberflus. The players felt like he lacked a willingness to listen to the players and the Players' Leadership Council. And he mismanaged the weekly team schedule. Before I get your opinion, Cassie, Ant, as a former player, what is your reaction to something like that?
Well, when you have that opportunity. I mean, the NFLPA, they've made it a point to do this because it's something that players can be educated about from one organization to the next, how you're treated, whether or not it's the athletic training staff, the way you travel, how your family is treated around the facilities and potentially on road trips. All these things end up being factors, but what most directly impacts wins and losses is how you interact with your coaches and how players feel about them. And Matt Eberflus, the season before was graded at a B. Just for full clarity, he was graded at a C this year, but that was last out of all 32 head coaches from this past season. And specific to the schedule, I did find it intriguing at the time, and I know we even discussed it at various points on Bears Blitz. Thomas Brown putting his own imprint on the team when he took over as interim head coach. he immediately went about changing the schedule. So I think that's probably, a bit of evidence that we can look back on in retrospect and say that it was something that perhaps not only the players thought was a bit odd in how Matt Eberflus went about just the day-to-day, week-to-week operation of things, but to immediately come in and change the schedule to something that everyone seemed more in line with and felt was more productive. That's probably a little bit of evidence of what we see in the grading system here.
Let me bring back Cassie Carlson, who's live in Indy. Cassie, when I read players felt like he lacked a willingness to listen to the players and the Players Leadership Council, did you hear that? You were inside the locker room. Did you get that feeling?
I don't know if I can answer that specifically. I would say that they had that leadership council and they met on a weekly basis. And I would go back to the first time we had heard about the leaders going to Matt Eberflus and specifically talking about Shane Waldron and wanting to be coached harder and wanting to be held accountable, and a lot of that going to the wayside early on. I don't know that they felt like maybe they were heard in that moment because I'm not sure how much changed in that sense. To Ant's point, the schedule changed from even a year ago. The way Matt Eberflus ran their practice and their day-to-day schedule was a little awkward, honestly, because I just think of like the media schedule when we would be able to go into open locker room, and typically that would be after a practice at the end of the day. This year it was before practice, and it was the way they split up walkthroughs and practice, and then that changed when Thomas Brown became interim head coach. So I think from what I had heard, honestly, I thought Eberflus maybe listened a little bit too much to the players when it came to their opinions on the practice schedule, and if they didn't like how long they were practicing, etc., he would change it. So maybe I thought that's what I had heard, but it could be different. I thought the most interesting part, too, is how this aligned timeline-wise, where it said that this survey was filled out, they got the results, and that was right in line of the same time that the whole meltdown in Detroit happened, and that's when they terminated Matt Eberflus. So I thought the timeline of that was kind of interesting as well.
Yeah, good point. All right, we need to take a timeout. Coming up, we hear from one of the top defensive tackles in this NFL draft coming up in April, Michigan's Mason Graham. Will he be available when the Bears select at number 10, barring a trade? We'll discuss next right here on Fox 32's Scouting for the Future. Welcome back. Naptown wide awake. Downtown Indianapolis, home to the NFL Scouting Combine through the weekend, bustling with draft prospects, coaches, GMs, scouts, media like our very own Cassie Carlson. Also there, we will bring in Cassie again shortly. Welcome back. Fox 32's NFL Scouting Combine, Scouting the Future show right here on Fox 32. Lou Canellis, Anthony Herron alongside. And Anthony also worked at the Big Ten Network this college football season, followed their football. Lots going on with Ohio State and Michigan. But I want to talk to Big Ant about what he saw from Michigan's Mason Graham.
I pride myself on playing the run and the pass because I feel like that's what a complete D lineman does. But obviously rushing the passer, I feel like I'm really good at too. I can run through guys or I can be a finesse guy too at the same time. I affect every snap, run or pass. I feel like I'm a dominant player, one of the most dominant players in this class. So I feel like I'm one of the most athletic guys here. I feel like I kind of proved that, and you can see it on my tape.
Graham, by the way, also said that if you want to see him in action, you need to check out his highlight tape against Ohio State.
Yeah, right.
Taking a dig at the Buckeyes. You love this guy. I remember you and I, Bears Game Day Live, Bears Game Night Live, and I asked you about Mason Graham, and your eyes lit up.
He's a marvel. He is. And it's not necessarily that he's one of these guys, because sometimes defensive linemen will come into the draft cycle where you see that they're 6'6", 320 pounds, and they got ripped six-pack abs, and they're going to run as fast as wide receivers. That's not necessarily Mason Graham. He's got enough from a stature perspective. He's 6'3". He's over 300 pounds. I don't know what he'll run exactly in the 40, but it's going to be fast enough. I don't know what his vertical jump is going to be. It's going to be impressive, but it's not going to wow folks to some sort of otherworldly extent. But he is just a phenomenal football player. He's got the sort of strength you want at the point of attack. He's extremely fundamentally sound. When teams have tried to run, like the Ohio State game, big mistake the Buckeyes made was to continue to run to the interior. The teeth of that Michigan defense were Mason Graham and, frankly, his teammate, who's also going to be a first-round pick, Kenneth Grant. We're both right there on the interior of that Wolverines defense, and Mason Graham is so fundamentally sound, exactly what you look for, inside hand placement, locking the blocker out, turning his shoulders when the double team would come, and then as a pass rusher, he can really be impactful, penetrating into the backfield, gets his shoulders turned, can get into creases, and he plays hard. There is all kinds of energy and there's coordination to his game that make him, he was a guy coming into the season, you wondered, could he end up being the #1 overall pick? We're not going to see him there, but he's going to be one of these guys who definitively goes in the top 10.
All right, I want to bring back Cassie. Cassie live at the Combine in Indy. And Cassie, you were there. Graham only 3.5 sacks this past season, but when Ben Johnson spoke to the media yesterday, and as I said, you were there. Johnson said, hey, the tape doesn't lie. Do you think that Mason Graham can be one of those guys that's a difference maker for the Bears if he's still free at 10?
Yeah, I think he could definitely be a difference maker for the Bears. I don't know if he's going to be available still at 10 because it all depends, I think, on if those quarterbacks go early. And the more that we're talking to people, it doesn't seem like they are going to go early. So I don't know how much he would actually fall. I thought one of the interesting stories he told is that he actually got into wrestling one summer. And he said it really helped with his leverage against interior offensive linemen. And he's not perfect at it at all, but he said wrestling and battling in the trenches is very, very similar. I did note what Big Ant mentioned, that he's not the biggest guy. Like, he's not very tall. We were kind of all talking about that after he walked off the podium. So, like, stature-wise, he didn't stand out that much, but I definitely think he can help on the interior. That's something that Ryan Poles also hinted at, that you need that interior pressure in order for your edge rushers to be successful and be able to hit home and hit the quarterback as well. I think that's going to be an area of need and an area that we'll debate until the NFL draft, because if the Bears address free agency, the offensive line, they address free agency, then do they prioritize the defensive line come the draft? I think that's one of the big question marks right now. I don't think you can have too many on either side. A lot of people that we've talked to have also said, while they're deep classes at those two positions, there is a pretty significant difference, though, in those top-tier blue-chip players compared to maybe the rest of the crop.
Keep Cassie on the screen with us right now. Guys, here's my worry. The Bears have not hit on a pass rusher in the draft in over 20 years. Does that worry you?
Very much so, because even when there's, you got guys who've been a part of the mix here in recent seasons, you'd love to see development, and even some of the guys who the Bears have taken, whether it's been first rounders who haven't panned out. I still think about Leonard Floyd, who's had a nice long career in the NFL, but at the time the Bears drafted Leonard Floyd in the top 10, they were hoping he was going to be an immediate impact Pro Bowl caliber pass rusher. He didn't turn it into that in Chicago. A lot of mid-round guys who they've taken as well who haven't been able to really break through and become extremely impactful for the Bears, whether it's been on the interior or the edge of their defense. So, yes, that's a real sign for concern.
Cassie, as I bring you back, number one, I want to get your feelings. Does that worry you that the Bears have not hit on a pass rusher in 20 years? And tell me what you're hearing about Jonathan Allen, who's apparently on the trade block, the Commanders' defensive tackle, who could then, you bring him in, he plays alongside Montez Sweat, who he spent time with in Washington. He's on a pretty decent contract, $15 million next season. What are you hearing, if anything?
Have not heard anything about Jonathan Allen so far. I think people are more interested if Myles Garrett, if the Bears would be interested in that at all. But Jonathan Allen has not been a name that's popped up so far. I'm in agreement that I think it's a little bit concerning that they haven't been able to hit on a defensive lineman. And I think Gervon Dexter is someone that people were hoping to have a more consistent and upward trajectory in his second season. And knowing that he's going into year 3, it's going to have to be a huge jump from him for him to, prove that he deserves to be here long term. So I think that's one area where we just haven't seen the Bears prioritize building and developing through the draft, or they haven't hit on it. So definitely an area of concern, and one that I think if there is a top guy there, like I would take him.
Yeah, I think to your point, Cass, the discussion we've had about Gervon Dexter, Zach Pickens here in recent seasons, some of it, especially to Dexter, you're projecting a bit because not every interior defensive lineman in college football is going to have immense stats. We put up the stats about Mason Graham. His film does not lie. He's been remarkably productive and consistent, but he's not a guy who's been a double-digit sack player in college, but he projects to that in the NFL. Gervon Dexter, schematically, was not a guy who played in a one-gap penetrating style as he played college football, so that was a projection that Ryan Poles was making and bringing him here to the Bears. We saw a leap from year 1 to year 2, but he still hasn't shown he can be that defensive tackle of the future. So to add depth up front, you look at what the Philadelphia Eagles did that led them to a Super Bowl, not only the top offensive line in football perhaps, but a team that could come at you in waves on that defensive front. So why, like I mentioned to you guys yesterday, I was a little bit surprised in getting rid of DeMarcus Walker because now you're making a thin position group even more thin with one of the guys who was at least most impactful for you along that defense.
Yeah, it made me feel like they have some type of plan. Cassie, Fox Sports' Jay Glazer said Ben Johnson's work with the offensive line is overlooked. Did Ben Johnson talk about it with you when you guys had the chance to sit down yesterday?
I think we talked more about philosophy with offensive line and the fact that in Detroit, they built that through the draft over a very long period of time. However, he also said that he believes that they do have pieces that can work on the offensive line, while he also singled out needing to improve it. So I think a point he made is it doesn't necessarily mean you have to change all 3 interior positions. You could make one change and have it make a huge difference. But the thing that he kept stressing is you just want to have physical players, guys that finish around the ball. You want to fall in love with the tape because the tape doesn't lie, and you don't want to get caught up in falling in love with a player after a 20-minute formal interview here at the Combine. You got to watch the tape and base your decisions off of that. And I think that might be something that Ryan Poles got caught up in the opposite way in the previous drafts.
Good point there. Big A, Will Campbell, we talked about him yesterday. LSU's fine left tackle. Calvin Banks Jr., how good are those two guys when we talk about offensive linemen? Because I'm told that neither of them are Joe Alt, who came into the draft last year.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think Will Campbell is probably the closest to it. He's got more mauler in him than the other guys who are right there being talked about at the top of the draft board. Calvin Banks, he's a player that's athletic. He's not overly immense in his physical stature, but his tape, his peak, his ceiling is maybe most impressive out of all these different offensive tackles, aside from Josh Simmons, who's a guy out of Ohio State that played really well in spurts, but he hasn't been a left tackle as consistently. So the guy who feels most close to being can't miss would be Campbell.
Real quickly, Cassie, let me bring in Cassie. Hey, Cassie, if the Bears don't get Chiefs guard Trey Smith or Falcons center Drew Dahlman in free agency, they have to use that 10th pick on an offensive lineman, right?
Yeah, I would think so. And I think, we talk about Trey Smith so much and that right guard position, him being the best option on the free agent market, you're going to have to pay a pretty penny. But I think we should also consider how important that center position is going to be, and the fact that Caleb was handling all protections at the line of scrimmage. So having a center that can alleviate some of that pressure and responsibility, I think could make a huge difference in what we see from Caleb Williams as well.
Good point. We need to take a break. Coming up, how do the Bears develop a winning culture? We will discuss when we return right here on Scouting the Future.
You can't get just players from winning programs, but I would start there. Like that feeling of knowing
They need winners in the locker room.
You know how to get it done. Like you've experienced it. That's why so many players, Georgia. I mean, the Philadelphia Eagles pile on the Georgia guys, right?
Voice of the Bears, Jeff Joniak, friends of the show, nice enough to join us here. We'll have more from Jeff tomorrow and online on Fox Local and our YouTube channel as well. Luke Canellis, along with Anthony Herron, Fox 32's NFL Scouting Combine Special, Scouting the Future with you. Cassie Carlson is live in Indy. Let's bring back Cassie real quickly. Last segment here. Joniak points out how the Eagles drafted a majority of Georgia guys, winners. Should the Bears focus on players that are coming from winning programs? You go first, Cassie.
Yeah, I think why not? Because they don't have many winners in the locker room, and that was very inevitable last season. I think it was also pretty telling that they only had eight. They had 8 captains on that team, which I think refers to the fact that they just had no true leaders. In that conversation, we were talking about Tyler Booker, the offensive lineman out of Alabama, who Nick Saban raves about, says he's essentially a leader like Will Anderson Jr. And I think you need to have those kind of guys on this offensive line.
How much of an effect would it have on guys in the locker room if you brought in guys that have been part of top 5 programs, national championships?
There's a balance to that. You know, you have to be aware of what made those programs winners. You know, sometimes guys come from winning programs because they're on the most talented teams. It doesn't always mean they've developed the winning habits. Now, Kirby Smart at Georgia, he's a guy who's really churned out players who can be successful in the NFL, as did Nick Saban at Alabama. So there is a balance to it. You know, you got to know the coach, the culture they've come from, how positive of an influence were they in setting that culture. Like Jalen Carter last year, remember, or a couple of years ago in this draft cycle, his immaturity showed up a lot between the end of that season at Georgia and the Bears passing on him in the top 10. Now, he's had a great start to his career, but not everyone who comes from a winning team necessarily means they're ready to be the tone setter in your locker room.
Cassie, before we say goodbye, we'll talk to you again tomorrow. What do you have coming up tomorrow?
Tomorrow's going to be another fun day. I'm actually talking to PFF's lead NFL draft analyst, Trevor Sikkema, tomorrow afternoon. So he'll be able to give us some more nitty-gritty on some of these offensive and defensive line prospects. So looking forward to that conversation and seeing what other national media members are around here. I think as it gets towards Friday, when the quarterbacks talk, things will start to ramp up.
All right, do me a favor. Go have another shrimp cocktail at St. Elmo's, will you? Oh, I love Cassie. I know you will. Have fun out there. Don't forget, tune in tomorrow as we continue our combine coverage from Indianapolis as well. Our show, Scouting the Future, 1 o'clock, Fox Local. And if you tune in later, you just want to watch it again in its entirety, you can always catch it on Fox 32's YouTube channel and fox32chicago.com. Big A, thanks for stopping by.
Appreciate you, buddy.
Good to see you. For Anthony Herron and Cassie Carlson, I'm Luke Canellis on your home of the Bears, Fox 32 Chicago. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you tomorrow afternoon at 1. Bye-bye.